Hello, my friends, and welcome. Before we settle in for tonight's story, I want to take a moment to thank you for being here. These bedtime tales are made to bring you comfort, stir your memories, and carry you gently into the night. If you enjoy these moments we share together, your support means the world. Please take a second to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss a story. I'd also love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below and tell us your city, your state, or even your country. It's always special to see how far these stories travel and to feel the connection between all of us. Your comments, likes, and shares help keep this channel alive and growing so we can bring you even more tales that warm the heart and calm the mind. Now, let's get comfortable, take a deep breath, and step together into tonight's story. I was walking through the botanical gardens that afternoon, the kind of place where time seems to slow down and the air smells faintly of damp soil and blossoms. My grandson was a few steps ahead, darting between the trimmed hedges, his laughter echoing like a breeze through the branches. That's when my eyes landed on it, a viburnum bush. One of its main branches snapped clean in half. Most folks might pass it by without a second glance, but for me it was like seeing an old friend in pain. My hand went instinctively to the brake, fingers brushing over the jagged wood, feeling the life still pulsing beneath. And in that moment, 1,000 memories came rushing in. Mornings when the grass was still wet with dew, the weight of pruning shears in my hand, the hum of bees working just as hard as I was. I've been retired for years now, but once tending to gardens was more than just a job to me. It was my craft, my pride, my life's work. I didn't just plant flowers, I raised them, cared for them, worried over them the way a father worries over his children. Every hedge I shaped, every rose I coaxed into bloom was a small piece of myself left behind in someone else's world. That broken branch, it was like a door creaking open in my mind. Suddenly, I was no longer a 70-year-old man strolling through someone else's garden. I was back in my youth. In the heat of summer, the smell of freshly cut grass clinging to my shirt, my arms tanned and aching from the day's work. Back when my hands were stronger, my back was straighter, and my dreams were just starting to take root. And so, right there, standing in front of that wounded viburnum, I began to tell my grandson, and perhaps remind myself, the story of how it all began. I suppose my love for gardens began before I even knew what the word meant. I was just a boy back then, growing up in a small Midwestern town where backyards stretched wide and wild, and every neighbor had a patch of earth they tended like a treasure. My parents didn't have much money, but they had a small garden behind our house. Neat rows of tomatoes, a patch of green beans, and in the corner, a single apple tree that shaded the old wooden bench where my father would sit after supper. I remember the first time I dug my hands into the soil. I'd help my father with the heavier work, turning the soil with a spade that felt far too big for my small hands, hauling buckets of water from the pump when the days were hot and dry. And though I'd grumble and sweat, there was something about the smell of freshly turned earth that made me feel alive. I remember one summer evening, sitting on that old bench with my father as the sun sank low, painting the sky in gold and pink. He didn't speak much. He was a man of few words, but he looked at our garden, then at me, and said, "If you take care of the land, son, it'll take care of you." I didn't fully understand what he meant back then, but I do now. It was those early days, those small, quiet lessons that set my life's path without me realizing it. I wasn't just learning how to grow plants, I was learning patience, care, and respect for the living things around me. And as I stood there in the botanical garden decades later, my fingers still resting on that broken branch, I could almost feel that same soil under my fingernails again. By the time I was 15, I knew I wanted to work with plants. While other boys in town were dreaming about cars, football, or getting out of our little corner of America, I was drawn to the quiet magic that happened in the soil. My high school offered summer job postings on a corkboard in the hallway, and one afternoon, my eyes landed on a faded flyer. Help wanted, Miller's greenhouse, no experience needed, must be willing to work hard. I tore it down before anyone else could read it. Mr. Miller's greenhouse sat on the edge of town, a long structure of glass panes that caught the morning sun like a cathedral. I'll never forget walking in that first day, the wave of humid warmth, the scent of damp earth and blooming geraniums wrapping around me like a living embrace. The air felt thick, alive, almost humming. Mr. Miller was a tall man with stooped shoulders from decades of bending over seedlings. His hands were cracked and stained with soil that no amount of washing could remove. "You're late," he said. Though I wasn't, I would later learn this was his way of saying, "Don't waste time." He put me to work sweeping the gravel floors, carrying bags of peat moss, and watering trays of delicate seedlings with a tin watering can so dented it looked older than me. At first I thought he didn't notice me much, but one afternoon, as I was lining up pots on a wooden bench, he came over and handed me a tiny basil plant. From seed, raised it myself. Let's see if you can keep it alive. That basil became my pride. I watered it, talked to it, made sure it had the best spot by the window. And when its leaves grew thick and fragrant, Mr. Miller didn't say, "Good job." He just gave a small nod. But that nod meant more to me than any trophy. By the end of that first summer, I could name 50 different plants by sight and tell you the best soil for each. I learned how to graft roses, how to spot disease before it spread, and how a well-pruned plant could surprise you with blooms long after you thought its season had passed. I also learned something else. Tending plants was a lot like tending people. Some needed space, some needed support, and all of them needed time. Looking back now, I realized that first job was more than a paycheck. It was a calling. And though I didn't know it yet, my life was already sprouting roots that would hold me for decades to come. Graduation came with the usual fanfare, the folding chairs on the football field, the smell of freshly cut grass mixing with the faint perfume of corsages, and the endless speeches. My mother, bless her, stayed quiet, but I caught the worried crease in her brow. Back then, being a gardener wasn't seen as much of a career. It wasn't glamorous, and it sure didn't pay like the factory or the oil fields. But I knew in my bones that if I turned away from it, I'd always wonder what could have been. So I took a job at a small landscaping company run by a wiry man named Frank, who swore more than he breathed. Frank had a reputation for being rough, but he knew his plants like a preacher knows scripture. He taught me how to read the soil just by holding it in my palm, how to prune a tree so it would grow strong instead of pretty, and how to design a garden that would still be alive a decade later. The work was hard. We hauled stone in the blazing July sun, dug in clay that fought back with every shovel, and planted hundreds of bulbs in the freezing wind of late fall. My hands blistered, my back ached, but every night I came home smelling of grass and earth. I felt like I'd done something worth doing. Still, there were days I'd catch myself wondering if my father had been right,
if maybe I was chasing something that wouldn't last. But then I'd see an old woman's face light up at the sight of her newly planted roses, or watch a bare patch of ground turn into a small paradise, and all my doubts would fade like morning fog. Those early years taught me more than the trade. They taught me that tending beauty in this world is worth every ounce of your strength, even if no one else understands. By my mid-20s, Frank had started trusting me with bigger jobs, not just mowing lawns or trimming hedges, but designing entire garden layouts for folks who wanted something special. That's when I first stepped onto the grounds of the Harrington Estate, a sprawling property on the edge of town with oaks older than the country itself and a main house that looked like it had been plucked straight from a postcard. Mrs. Harrington was a widow in her 70s, sharp as a tack, and dressed like she'd stepped out of a 1950s fashion magazine. She'd walk with me through the property, pointing with her cane and talking about flowers like they were old friends. "Those peonies," she'd say, "they've been here longer than you've been alive. Don't you dare move them." I didn't, but I gave them a proper bed, richer soil, and a blanket of mulch to see them through the winter. Working there changed the way I saw gardening. It wasn't just maintenance, it was storytelling. Every plant, every path, every bench had a history. Some trees had been planted for births, some roses for anniversaries, some lilacs for those who'd passed on. I realized I wasn't just tending to plants, I was tending to memories. And it was on that estate that I met Bill. He was another gardener, a good 10 years older than me, built like a barn door, with a laugh that carried across the yard. We worked side by side for years, talking about everything from weather patterns to women we'd loved and lost. Bill became more than a coworker. He became the older brother I never had. We weathered storms together, literal ones and the kind life throws at you when you least expect it. I still remember the summer when a late frost wiped out half our spring plantings. We stood there in the early morning, staring at the damage, and Bill just shook his head and said, "Nature's in charge, kid. We just rent the space." But there were good years too, seasons when the tulips exploded in color so vivid it made your heart ache, when the hedges grew exactly as you'd hoped, when clients hugged you like family because the garden had become their sanctuary. Those jobs, those friendships, taught me something I'd carry all my life. In gardening, as in living, you can't control every storm. But if you keep showing up, keep your hands in the soil, beauty will find its way back. By the time I hit 35, I'd spent more than a decade working for other people. Good people, mind you. But I started feeling that itch, the kind that makes a man wonder if he's meant to keep following or finally start leading. It wasn't about money. It was about having something that was mine. A name on the side of a truck, a business built on my own sweat and reputation. I wanted to choose my projects, shaped gardens the way I believe they should grow.
I remember sitting at my kitchen table one night, a half-empty coffee mug beside me. Bills spread out like fallen leaves. My wife, Laura, leaned against the counter and said, "If you're gonna do it now. Don't wait until you're too old to get your hands dirty." She had that way of cutting right to the truth. So, I did it. Bought a secondhand pickup, a set of tools I couldn't really afford, and printed business cards that read, "Greenway Gardens, Samuel Parker, owner." The first jobs were small. Front yard cleanups, planting seasonal flowers, fixing old irrigation systems that coughed and sputtered like tired lungs. But word spread. Folks liked my work. And more importantly, they trusted me. I hired my first crew member, a young man named Eddie, fresh out of high school. Nervous as a rabbit and green as spring grass, but he had a good work ethic. Over time, more people joined, folks who became my team, my second family. We had nicknames for each other, inside jokes, a shared language built on seasons and soil. Some days were pure joy, like the time we transformed a barren backyard into a blooming paradise for a couple celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. I can still see the wife's eyes filling with tears when she stepped outside. Other days were backbreaking, the kind that leave your hands raw and your shoulders screaming. But even then, there was a satisfaction in standing back at sunset, wiping the sweat from my brow and knowing that I'd left the land better than I'd found it. Looking back now, I realize that's when I stopped just being a gardener and became a caretaker of dreams. Every flower bed was a promise, every tree a hope for the future. It was the summer of '88 when the trouble came, and it came hard. The spring rains never showed up, and by June the ground was so dry it cracked under your boots like brittle pottery. The air shimmered with heat, and even the weeds looked like they'd given up on living. Clients started calling, worried about their lawns, their vegetable patches, their prized roses. I did everything I could. Early morning watering, shading fragile plants with burlap, even hauling barrels of water in that old pickup. But nature had her own plans, and I was no match for her fury. By mid-July, jobs were drying up along with the soil. Folks didn't want to pay for a garden that couldn't survive, and I couldn't blame them. My crews still needed paychecks, though, and every Friday I'd sit in my truck a few extra minutes before handing them their envelopes, counting what little I'd have left for my own family. One day, Eddie came to me after work. He was older by then, stronger, with calloused hands that told their own story. "Sam, you've been paying us out of your own pocket, haven't you?" I tried to brush it off, but he looked me dead in the eye. "Don't you dare quit on us. We'll get through this, together." Those words stuck with me. See, gardening isn't just about planting in good weather. It's about tending, protecting, and believing that better days will come, even when the earth feels dead beneath you. And they did come. That fall, the rains finally returned. The soil drank deep, the grass pushed through in pale green tufts, and the flowers, they bloomed like they'd been holding their breath all summer. Some clients came back, some didn't. But I learned something that year. Resilience isn't built in the easy seasons. It's born in the ones that test you, strip you down, and dare you to keep going. It was early spring the following year. The kind where the mornings still bite at your fingers, but the afternoons smell faintly of thawed earth. I was out repairing a wooden trellis for a regular client when the phone rang back at the shop. Martha, my wife, answered. She stepped outside, hand over the receiver, and said, "Sam, you'll want to take this one." On the other end was a woman named Mrs. Whittemore. I had never heard of her, but she spoke with that slow, careful elegance of someone who'd lived their life in old money and big houses. She said she had a garden, a very large garden that had been neglected since her husband passed. "It was his pride," she told me. "I can't bear to see it like this anymore. Can you help me?" When I arrived at her estate, I nearly forgot to breathe. The place stretched for acres. Overgrown hedges, sprawling lawns, flower beds choked with weeds, a pond gone stagnant and green. It was a beautiful ruin, the kind you could almost hear whispering of better days. She gave me a tour, talking not about the plants, but about the memories they held. The lilacs where she'd stood for wedding photos, the oak tree where her husband used to read the paper, the wisteria arch he'd built with his own hands. Every inch of that garden was a love letter to a life they'd shared. I told her it would take weeks, maybe months, but I'd bring it back. And I meant it. My crew and I worked sunrise to sunset, cutting, pruning, digging, reseeding. Some days my back ached so bad I thought I'd never stand up straight again. But every time Mrs. Whittemore stepped outside with that small, grateful smile, I felt 20 years younger. By summer, the place was transformed. Roses climbed the trellises again, the pond was clear and sparkling, and the lawn rolled out in perfect green waves. On our final day, she handed me a small envelope. Inside was a note in perfect cursive. "You've given me back a piece of my life. I'll never forget it." And tucked behind the note, a check big enough to cover the dry summer we'd just survived with enough left over to replace the old pickup. But it wasn't the money that stayed with me. It was the way she looked at that garden, as if she'd found her husband again in every bloom and leaf. I realized then my work wasn't just about plants. It was about preserving people's histories, their loves, their stories, and I carried that with me for the rest of my life. It was late August, and the heat lay heavy over the valley, pressing down like a thick wool blanket. The kind of summer where the soil turns to dust by noon and sticks to your skin until you feel part of the earth itself. That's when he showed up, a wiry kid named Luke, no more than 20, standing awkwardly by the shop door, twisting a baseball cap in his hands. "I heard you might need some help," he said, eyes darting to the floor. His voice had that mix of hope and uncertainty I remembered from my own younger days, when I had been knocking on doors with nothing to offer but strong arms and a willingness to work. Truth was, I didn't need help. But there was something in the way he looked at the tools hanging on the wall. Not like a customer, not like a thief, but like someone seeing old friends. I told him to come by the next morning at 6 a.m. sharp. That first week, I watched him like a hawk. He wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, literally. Whether it was hauling mulch or kneeling in the mud to reset a row of hydrangeas, he worked without complaint. But more than that, he noticed things. A gardener can be taught how to dig, trim, and water, but noticing, seeing the way a rose wilts before it's thirsty, or how a maple leaf turns a day early when the soil pH drifts, that's a gift you're born with. I started showing him the things that books and manuals never teach: how to test soil by rubbing it between your fingers, how to prune apple trees so they bear sweeter fruit, how to talk to a client about their plants without ever making them feel ignorant. We'd ride in the truck together before sunrise, coffee steaming in paper cups, the world still quiet except for the hum of tires on old asphalt. I'd tell him stories about Mrs. Whitmore's garden, about the years when drought nearly ruined me, about the first time I planted a row of sunflowers and watched them all bow in the same direction. One afternoon, as we were planting a row of ornamental grasses for a new client, he stopped, brushed the dirt from his palms, and said, "You really love this, don't you?" I didn't answer right away. The breeze was moving through the grass, making it whisper. Finally, I said, "Son, I've given my back, my hands, and most of my life to the soil, and it's given me everything in return." That was the day I realized something. This kid wasn't just another set of hands. He was the future of everything I'd built. And maybe, just maybe, he was the one I could trust to carry my life's work forward when my own knees gave out. It was a Tuesday in early May when I decided it was time to test Luke. The sky was overcast, that soft gray light that makes colors look richer, the kind of day perfect for planting. I handed him the keys to the old Chevy truck, the one with the faded green paint and the dent in the fender from where I'd once backed into a client's fence post. I told him, "You're heading to the McAllister place. Front yard redo, lilacs along the fence, peonies by the porch. You know the layout, you've seen the plans. I'll be here, working on the community garden. You're on your own." He looked at me like I just handed him the deed to the whole farm. Nervous, but also proud. His voice cracked just a little when he said, "I won't let you down." When he drove off, the sound of the truck's engine faded.
2 days later, Mrs. McAllister herself called me. She's a woman in her 70s, sharp as a tack, the type who notices if you so much as tilt a planter an inch off center. "That boy you sent," she said. "He's got the hands of an artist and the manners of a gentleman. Don't you go letting him slip away." That night, over dinner, I told Luke what she'd said. He just shrugged and went back to eating, but I could see the corners of his mouth twitching upward. That's when I knew he'd passed the test, not because he'd done the job right, but because he'd done it quietly right. No bragging, just pride in a day's honest work. It struck me then, someday, the people in this town would be calling him when they wanted their gardens cared for, and they wouldn't even think to ask for me. And somehow, that thought didn't make me sad. By the summer, Luke had become more than just my apprentice. He had begun to weave himself into the very fabric of the neighborhood. Families I'd worked with decades ago started stopping him in the street. Kids waved as he carried bundles of flowers past the sidewalks. Older folks leaned over their fences, tipping their hats, saying things like, "Your hands remind me of someone who knew what he was doing back in the 70s. I followed him one morning to the Parker estate, a place I hadn't set foot in for years. As we approached, I could see why. The yard was a tangled mess, overgrown with brambles and ivy climbing the fences like it was trying to claim the property. Luke surveyed it for a moment, wiped his brow, and then got to work. While he dug and pruned, I wandered the edges, remembering. This was the yard I'd planted the first roses in after moving to town. The same roses I'd nursed through droughts, frost, and a particularly harsh winter that killed half the plants. I thought about the Parker kids I'd taught to prune the hedges, their little hands trembling, eager to learn. And now, decades later, Luke was doing the same. Teaching, restoring, caring. And the cycle of care and respect continued. Neighbors began to notice the change. Someone posted pictures online. Word spread. Soon people were calling, asking if Luke could take on their gardens, and even long-forgotten clients from my earlier years returned to see the work. I watched quietly, pride swelling in my chest, the same pride I'd felt when I first saw a garden flourish because of my hands and patience. One evening, after a long day, Luke and I sat on the tailgate of the truck, sipping water and letting the wind carry the scent of fresh soil. He looked at me, wiping dirt off his palms, and said, "I get it now. This isn't just gardening. It's history, isn't it?" I nodded, feeling every line on my face deepen with memories. "Yes, son," I said. "Every plant, every hedge, every flower, it tells a story. And now you're helping tell it." For the first time in years, I felt that full circle moment. The satisfaction of work done well, the passing of knowledge to the next generation, and the deep, quiet joy of knowing my life's labor would endure even after I was gone. One late afternoon, I found myself wandering alone through the far end of the garden, where the lilacs met the old fence line. The sun had begun its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose. The air smelled of warm soil, crushed leaves, and a hint of jasmine from the hedges Luke had tended. I paused and ran my fingers over the rough bark of an apple tree I'd planted decades ago, remembering the hands that had held the spade, the sweat rolling down my brow, the ache in my shoulders after long days under the sun. It struck me how fast the years had gone. So many moments I'd thought I'd never remember.
I laughed softly, letting the tension in my shoulders melt. Son, I spent my life under the sun, in the dirt, teaching, learning, and fixing what I could. Hard? Yes. Worth it? Every single day. As we walked back toward the main house together, I felt a quiet joy, the kind that fills your chest so fully you almost want to laugh out loud. Life had been unpredictable, sometimes cruel, sometimes gentle, but I wouldn't trade a single moment. And now, seeing Luke grow into the role I'd once held, I understood the real gift of my work. It was never about the plants alone. It was about nurturing people, memories, and the enduring pulse of the community I loved. That fall, I knew my time in the garden was winding down. The air had that crisp bite that reminded me of childhood mornings, running barefoot through frost-kissed grass before school. The golden light lingered longer on the hedges, casting shadows that danced across the soil, as if the garden itself were saying goodbye. I worked slower these days, my back reminding me of every year spent bending, lifting, and planting. Each movement was deliberate, each breath savored. I showed Luke how to prune the apple trees for the last time, explaining every cut and every angle as though passing on a sacred secret. He watched me closely, nodding, mimicking my movements with a mix of reverence and excitement. One afternoon, a neighbor approached, holding a basket of fresh apples. "You've done more for this garden than anyone else," she said softly, her eyes glistening, "and it shows." I nodded, feeling the weight of decades settle in my chest. I remembered the first seedlings I'd planted, the long summers, the storms, the droughts, the laughter, and even the arguments. And now, seeing Luke tending the rows with quiet confidence, I realized that the garden would thrive long after I was gone. The life I'd poured into it, and into the people around me, would continue, growing, changing, thriving. On the last day of my active work, I walked through the garden at sunrise, the dew sparkling on every leaf, the roses standing tall, the lilacs perfuming the air. Luke was already there, quietly watering, the morning light glinting off his tools. I put my hand on his shoulder, feeling the strength of youth and the promise of the future. "You've got this. Keep it alive. Take care of the plants, but also take care of the people who love them. That's what matters." He smiled, and for a moment the years fell away. I could see myself as the young man I once was, hopeful and eager, learning from mistakes, discovering joy in the simplest things. And now I was older, wiser, content, proud that my life had mattered, that my work, my legacy, would continue through someone who understood it, someone who respected it, and someone who would love it as much as I did. As I walked back to the house, the sun rising higher, the scent of earth and flowers filling the air, I felt it deeply. Peace, satisfaction, gratitude. Life had been unpredictable, sometimes cruel, sometimes gentle, but it had been mine, and that I realized was more than enough. That evening I sat on the old wooden bench at the edge of the garden, the sky a deep violet streaked with pink. The scent of the day lingered, freshly turned soil, roses still damp from the late mist, the faint sweetness of ripening berries. Luke was inside, tidying up tools, humming softly, a sound that reminded me of my younger self whistling while planting rows of vegetables. I took a slow sip of warm tea, feeling it spread through my chest, warming more than just my body. My hands were dirt-streaked and calloused, reminders of a lifetime spent shaping the earth, coaxing life from it, watching it grow, nurturing it, and occasionally mourning what had failed. I let my eyes wander across the rows of corn, tomatoes, lilacs, and apple trees, each one a chapter of my story. Memories flowed like the wind through the branches. I remembered my father teaching me to hold a spade just right, my first paycheck from a summer job tending a neighbor's garden, the long afternoons under the sun with friends who became family, the quiet evenings alone when work was done,
but dreams still stirred. I thought of love lost and found, of children grown and carrying pieces of my life forward in their laughter and their questions about the world. Luke emerged with a final basket of apples and set it beside me. "Evening's quiet," he said. "Yes, it always was, and it still is. There's peace in seeing what you've built, knowing it will last. That's the reward, more than money, more than praise. It's the life you've lived and the lives you've touched."
The sun slipped beneath the horizon and the first stars appeared, shimmering faintly. I leaned back, letting the cool breeze brush against my face, and allowed myself a long, deep breath. The garden, my life, my memories, they all felt whole, alive, and enduring. For the first time in a long time, I felt no regret, no what-ifs, only gratitude. Gratitude for the years, the work, the friends, the family, and even the struggles that had shaped me. I had lived fully, loved deeply, and now, in the quiet of twilight, I could finally rest, knowing it was enough. And I smiled, because life, with all its unpredictability, had been mine, and it had been beautiful. That night, I sat in my favorite armchair by the window, a soft lamp casting a warm glow across the room. Outside, the garden rested under a blanket of moonlight, every leaf, every branch, every bloom holding the quiet testament of years gone by. I held a cup of tea, its steam curling into the still night air, and let myself sink into reflection. I thought about the boy I once was, eager and impatient, learning to bend a spade, to prune a hedge, to nurture life from the soil. I remembered the summers of sweat and laughter, the winters of frost and quiet solitude, the friends who had come and gone, the colleagues who had shaped me, the family that had filled my heart with love and sometimes worry. Every experience, every challenge, every small victory, it was all here, in these walls, in this garden, in me. I felt the echoes of the lives I had touched. Luke, now carrying on the work, the neighbors who still waved, the clients whose homes bloomed under my care. I realized that my life had been more than a series of days. It had been a mosaic of connections, of care, of patience and persistence. And now, even as age crept into my bones and hair, I felt the profound contentment of knowing I had done my best, loved fully, and left a legacy. The room was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves outside and the gentle ticking of the clock. I closed my eyes and let the memories wash over me like a warm breeze, the scent of fresh earth, the laughter of children, the quiet hum of summer evenings. A smile tugged at my lips, for I knew this: the life I had lived, with all its twists and turns, hardships and joys, was exactly the life I had wanted. And as I sipped my tea, feeling the warmth, I whispered to the night, to the garden, and to the past, "Thank you. I am grateful. I am content. I am home." In that stillness, I understood something simple and profound. Happiness isn't in the grand moments alone, but in the life fully lived, the work well done, the love given and received, and the quiet certainty that when the sun sets, it sets on a life that mattered. And with that, I rested, my heart full, my soul at peace,
ready for the gentle drift into sleep, carrying with me decades of memories, lessons, and love.